Front and Center. Front and Center. A focus on important and significant developments affecting the lives of Filipinos, not only in the Philippines, but also those living and working around the world. Join us in Front and Center. Front and Center. Here on Radyo Pilipinas World Service.
Welcome to Front and Center, where we focus on developments in the Philippines. Legislation that provides policies and directions that strives to promote a better economy for the country. Issues that concern the welfare and well-being of every Filipino. All of these and more will be Front and Center. Join me in this program here on Radyo Pilipinas World Service. You can watch this program on our Facebook page and YouTube channel, Radyo Pilipinas World Service. And this program, Front and Center, can also be heard on the following shortwave frequencies: 12.010 MHz, 15.640 MHz, and 17.820 MHz. Join us for another edition of Front and Center. I'm your host, Jerome Toledo. My guest in this edition of Front and Center is a renowned maritime law expert. A scuffle between Philippines and China rages on, and it is far from over. Recently, a Philippine Navy personnel sustained severe injuries after the China Coast Guard intentionally rammed the vessel he was aboard during the rotation and resupply mission in Ayungin Shoal in the West Philippine Sea on Monday. This new incident adds up to countless number of standoffs between Manila and Beijing in asserting its power and rights in the disputed waters west of the Philippines. Philippine Navy spokesperson Commodore Roy Trinidad said the CCG's unprofessional conduct towards a legitimate humanitarian mission is unacceptable. He called for restraint towards China. He added the AFP remains committed to maintaining the country's presence in the West Philippine Sea, adhering to international law to protect our seas, our rights, and our future. Many countries have already expressed grave concern over Beijing's action, such as water cannoning, conducting radio challenges, near collision activities, among others in the West Philippine Sea. It called for the peaceful resolution of disputes at sea. Meanwhile, there is a legislative Executive Development Advisory Council, or LEDAC priority bill that is up for President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s signature, and that is the Maritime Zones Act bill. And this bill sets the archipelagic boundaries as well as the Philippines' internal waters and exclusive economic zones. Philippine Senator Francis Tolentino, the author of the Senate version of the bill, has said that it will serve as the cornerstone of the Philippines' maritime policy, protecting the sovereignty and addressing the national security needs. Once enacted into a full-fledged law, it would highlight the Philippines' sovereign rights and jurisdiction over its EEZ in the West Philippine Sea, the waters of the South China Sea that lie within Manila's jurisdiction, and Benham Rise of the country's eastern seaboard in the Philippine Sea. To further discuss these matters at hand, I spoke with the maritime law expert, and here is the interview of the program with maritime law expert and serving as the director of the University of the Philippines Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, Professor J. Batongbakal. Professor J. Batongbakal, the maritime law expert, and at the same time serving as the director of University of the Philippines Institute of Maritime of the Law of the Sea. Thank you so much for joining us in the program Front and Center here on Radyo Pilipinas World Service.
Yes, good day to you as well.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Welcome. And first things first, Professor Batongbakal, the Philippines side suffered another harassment from the China Coast Guard this week, which Armed Forces of the Philippines Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. described it as a pirate-like action. So may we get your reaction to this latest incident?
Well, definitely, this latest incident is the most serious incident so far, because we saw the China Coast Guard committing acts of violence against the members of the Philippine Navy on board Philippine vessels. Okay, so for an ordinary person, yes, it does look like what a pirate would do, a criminal, maritime piracy, no, a criminal would do at sea. But for purposes of states, this clearly is an illegal and unlawful use of force that is contrary to the principles of the United Nations Charter, and it is contrary to international law.
Okay. Since there was a soldier that was injured or severely injured due to that incident, is there any like a liability on the China side, like criminal liability, since one of our soldiers has been harmed on that incident?
Well, since this act was perpetrated by members of the China Coast Guard, they are acting on behalf of China. They are agents of the state, and therefore any liability, responsibility, and accountability actually lies directly with the state itself, meaning China. So China is internationally responsible for the actions of its agents, especially in this case where those actions were taken against a sovereign vessel of another country and against its crew. Okay?
Uh, and if the soldier that has been injured should file a case, where he is going to file it?
Well, I think that here again, the soldier or the Navy personnel who was injured, on the other hand, was also a an agent of the state, an agent basically of the Philippines. No, that's the Philippine side. So actually, here you could consider it. You consider that the Philippines itself, as a country, as a state, is itself has itself suffered the injury. No? And therefore, any claims for, say, compensation, reparation for that will have to be made by the Philippines on behalf of its agent. Okay, so it's not something that you bring to a court like you would perhaps in a civil case or a criminal case in a domestic court. It is something that becomes the subject that has to become subject of negotiations between the states concerned.
Oh, okay. So it's like a talk between the Philippine government and the Chinese government
Yes,
that will
yes,
that will
because
take place.
yeah, because the fact that both sides involved agents of the state, no, basically they're representing the state, they're acting on behalf of the state, no. So the personal effects of those interactions, no, those are different. Those are separate. No, what matters is that they were both acting on behalf of the state when that incident occurred.
I see. Okay. Professor Batumbakal, some experts say China seems like testing the Philippines United States Mutual Defense Treaty by doing harassments without using their guns. And now they resort to using knives, spears, and bolos to prevent the Philippines resupply mission from reaching the BRP Sierra Madre. So do you think the Philippines should review its current approach on this and to resort now into such a kind of approach as well to defend itself, like arming its troops with clubs or batons or even the use of bolos too?
Well, that option, of course, is available. After all, China has demonstrated that it is willing to use these kinds of weapons against the personnel of the Philippines. But whether or not they should do it is a matter of policy that the leadership of both the armed forces and the government, no, basically the president's commander in chief, should consider. It's up for them to make that decision because in addition, no, these personnel of the Navy, when they undertake these missions and carry out these activities, not only are they acting as agents of the state, they're also in a way articulating or manifesting the foreign policy of the state, the foreign policy of the Philippines. No? So it's very important that the foreign policy of the Philippines is also reflected in how they act, no, and how they carry out their missions. No? So the carriage of weapons for purposes of personal protection,
Mm-hmm.
personal self-defense, essentially, is of course available, no? And that is actually a very reasonable
Mm-hmm.
course of action. However, the implications, perhaps, of another incident which involves the use of these weapons, no, then that is a matter of discussion, no,
Mm-hmm.
and deliberate decision making on the part of government, no, whether or not the government would be willing, no, to would be willing to accept any potential risks arising uh, from that situation.
I see. Okay. I would like to ask this, Professor Batumbakal. So, what are your thoughts on this? That some experts say it is now the time for Manila to invoke the MDT with Washington, while others say it will only escalate the current tensions in the West Philippine Sea.
Well, number one, I think there is this very common misconception that the MDT is for some reason inactive or inert or sleeping, shall we say, and needs to be activated, no? Or is
Mm-hmm.
has yet to be activated by the occurrence of an incident and a decision
Mm-hmm.
to invoke or to trigger the MDT. This is actually a common misconception. The MDT is already in force. It is already active. No? What people should be asking for actually is what should the Philippines now do, no? As well as the United States, in light of the actions that have been taken by China. No? Under the MDT, um, the Philippines and the United States are legally obligated, no, to respond to certain things such as a request for consultation, no, or a decision to take joint action in response to an incident such as an armed attack or other unlawful acts of aggression
Mm-hmm.
committed against one of the parties. That has already, I believe, been invoked. If you'll notice in this past week, I think yesterday, there's already a press release stating that the Foreign Affairs Secretary
Mm-hmm.
has met with the Ambassador of the United States, for example, to discuss the incident. No?
Yeah.
That
Okay.
actually falls already within Article 3 of the Mutual Defense Treaty. No? Parties may consult with each other
Mm-hmm.
uh, in response to any act which could threaten the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of either party, no? Or in response to, here in this case, an
Mm-hmm.
attack on one of their troops, vessels, or aircraft.
I see. In that sense, Professor Batumbakal, MDT is active through diplomatic collaborations with Manila and Washington. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, diplomatic collaboration is one of them, meaning coordinating now their respective um, actions vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the international community.
Mm-hmm.
No? It can also result in agreements on things like economic initiatives, no, such as
Mm-hmm.
sanctions or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It can also involve political action, such
I see.
as going to the United Nations
Mm-hmm.
or talking with other countries to seek cooperation
I,
on what would be the appropriate response to China's actions.
I see.
Okay, so a whole menu of options is actually available.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there is a very common misconception
Mm-hmm.
that all the MDT does is to start a war, no? And
Mm-hmm.
that's what people normally associate the term "invoke the MDT"
Mm-hmm.
means, no? That is not correct. It
Okay.
is invoking the MDT, triggering the MDT, implementing the MDT is not limited to
Mm-hmm.
engaging in outright armed conflict or war. Okay,
Okay.
anything less than actually engaging in armed conflict is also included within the scope of what the parties can do under the MDT.
I see. And since its inception, MDT is already active. Uh, I would like to ask also, is the EDCA Balikatan exercises are a component of this mutual defense treaty?
Yes, and
Okay,
actually, the EDCA is one of the instruments that implements the MDT.
I
Okay. The
see.
other is the Visiting Forces Agreement,
Mm-hmm.
and there you also have the Mutual Logistic Support Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Mutual Security Board Agreement. So you have all of these other documents, other agreements that implement the
I see.
Mutual Defense Treaty. The Mutual Defense Treaty is only a broad framework
Mm-hmm.
document. It establishes the basis for this relationship between the Philippines and the United States. So what else they do with that relationship, no, is seen in these implementing agreements like the VFA and the EDCA,
Mm-hmm.
as well as their activities under the auspices of these documents, such as the Balikatan exercises, have been carried out annually since the
Mm-hmm.
1990s.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you see here that really the MDT already is being implemented. It is quite active.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and it's already active for a long time. Okay, Professor Batumbakal, I would like to also ask this. All of us want to settle this issue peacefully, and China signals its displeasure on the intervention of other parties, particularly the Western allies of the Philippines in the dispute on that disputed waters west of the Philippines. In many conflicts around the world, we saw the United Nations peacekeepers intervene just to make sure the conflicting parties do not escalate the hostilities on the fields or battlegrounds. Are there instances or cases that which the United or the UN peacekeepers were also deployed on disputed waters? So if there's such a case, do you think it could be applied to the West Philippine Sea dispute?
Well, the peacekeeping activities of the United Nations are done. They're undertaken only upon the decision of the UN Security Council.
Mm,
And these peacekeeping missions are intended to ensure that a threat to regional peace and stability, no, is prevented. No, it does not escalate into full-blown armed conflict. Okay. Now,
mm,
the problem, however, is that the UN Security Council um, um, works and decides by vote of the Security Council members.
mm,
And of the Security Council members, there is what we call the Permanent Five, the P5 powers,
yeah. Mm,
who each have a veto power,
yeah.
no? Despite votes, an overwhelming vote by most members of the Security Council, a P5 member can still veto
Mm.
a decision
Even
of
one,
the Security
even one
Council. Yeah. In one.
permanent
No?
member.
Yes, just
Okay.
one permanent member is enough to prevent the Security Council from reaching a decision.
I,
And China, the People's Republic of China, which is responsible for these activities, they are a P5 member. So it is certain that they will also veto
mm,
any attempt of the Philippines to bring this matter up to the Security Council for decision.
so they will block any attempt of any nation that will submit a proposal to deploy a peacekeeper or to make a peaceful resolution to that disputed waters.
Yes, they will definitely veto any proposal to do that.
I see. Okay, just a follow-up question, Professor Batumbakal. Representative Erwin Tulfo filed a resolution urging the Department of Foreign Affairs to present the current situation in the West Philippine Sea to United Nations General Assembly. And should we raise the case to UN Security Council? Its permanent members, including China, will use its veto power, like you mentioned, to block the resolution. Unlike in UN GA, it will be decided by the numbers. So, is stating our case in the General Assembly more appropriate than raising it in the Security Council in this issue?
Well, they're both appropriate. It's just that it's the probability of securing a favorable resolution. No?
Mm-hmm.
That's the actual objective. It's different for each one. On account of the P5 veto power, it's not likely in the Security Council. However, in the General Assembly,
Mm-hmm.
we have a little bit more chance of success there. But the mere principal challenge is that that means we're going to have to deal with all of the members of the General Assembly and secure the necessary number of votes. No?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the only challenge. So yes, it is possible. It is possible. It's feasible,
Mm-hmm.
uh, even though it is difficult. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Uh, since China is a permanent member of the Security Council, so no
No,
matter,
no.
uh,
Simply because
mm-hmm.
China is also a member of the General Assembly.
So it,
So
mm-hmm.
these are separate bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Getting resolutions from them is based on different what you call this requirements, voting requirements. So in the Security Council, is a Security Council members, but there's also a permanent five veto. Um, but in the General Assembly, it's basically majority rule. Okay.
Mm.
That's why it's different voting requirements for each two.
Oh, okay, I see. What do you think the Philippine government should do next, given the continuing escalation of tensions in the West Philippine Sea? Seems like this is far from over regarding this situation. So, what do you think the Philippine government should do?
Well, given the seriousness of the recent incident, no, it is well within the rights of the Philippines to raise awareness of the members of the United Nations
Mm-hmm.
about these actions of China. Because as we mentioned, no, these acts are um, illegal and unlawful uses of force contrary to the United Nations. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, United Nations Charter. Okay, so just the mere fact that that has happened, no, that we have this situation is already enough for a country like the Philippines to raise its concerns to the UN General Assembly. Okay. So we can do that, and by raising awareness, we can therefore hope to also try to mobilize international
Mm-hmm.
opinion
Mm.
to our side, no, and that
Favorable
create.
opinion. Sorry.
Sorry.
And that would mean a favorable opinion.
Yes, if we are able to master the numbers, then we could secure a
Mm-hmm.
favorable resolution.
Yeah.
So it all depends on what the Philippines wants to do, what kind of support the Philippines wants to seek from the General Assembly.
I see. All right. Okay, moving on to the Maritime Zones Act. Since this Maritime Zones Act is LEDAC priority bills that is up for sign or up for signature of Philippine President Ferdinand R. Marcos Jr. So for this one, Professor Batumbakal, as a maritime law expert, how do you see this Maritime Zones Act if it will be signed and eventually enacted? So how is China going to react at the same time to the enactment of this upcoming law?
Well, I think, first of all, the Maritime Zones Act is important for us because it will clearly define the extents of our maritime zones, and that
Mm-hmm.
also means that it will clearly define the authorities and jurisdictions of the Philippines, no, especially vis-a-vis foreign nations and their vessels and aircraft. No? Um,
Mm-hmm.
that is a basic requirement for us to be able to effectively carry out law enforcement and also to effectively manage our waters
Mm-hmm.
consistently with international law. It implements the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as well as the 2016 South China Sea Arbitration, which ruled on our entitlements to our EEZ and continental shelf, no?
Mm-hmm.
Or the West Philippine Sea, and invalidated China's excessive claims, no? To the area encompassed by the Nine Dash Line in the South China Sea. Okay, so that's why it's very important for us. For China, on the other hand, they have already indicated no, in some press statements that they are going to react very negatively to the enactment of this Maritime Zone Act.
Mm-hmm.
And the underlying reason is very clear. It's because by enacting the Maritime Zone Act, not only is the Philippines implementing the 2016 South China Sea arbitration, which they reject,
Mm-hmm.
it will also demonstrate, no, that the Philippines does not give any regard to their excessive claims, no, illustrated by the nine dash line. Okay? They do not. It is a very clear rejection and non-recognition of China's excessive claims to sovereignty and jurisdiction over the South China Sea.
Okay. All right. Professor Batumbakal, since okay, Philippines is not alone regarding this territorial disputes. We also have Vietnam, Taiwan, Brunei, and Taiwan at the same time claiming on those disputed waters. And in relation to that, Vietnam has released a statement saying that they are ready to discuss with the Philippine government regarding the Philippine submission of an extended continental shelf claim in the South China Sea, and and when they're submitting their ECS claims, coastal states must respect the legal and legitimate rights and interests of other relevant coastal nations with opposite or adjacent coasts. Given that Vietnam asserts its rights on some island claims in the West Philippine Sea, should the Philippine government sit and talk with the Vietnamese government, particularly by having a bilateral discussion?
Yes, of course, no, because with respect especially to the claims in the South China Sea, no, and in
Mm-hmm.
this case, the extended continental shelf in the South China Sea, it is clear that the Philippines and Vietnam do have overlapping
Yeah.
claims in the central area, which is part of the high seas that is common to all nations. No? Vietnam essentially is taking the same position as the Philippines with respect to the proper implementation of UNCLOS.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they have a common ground, no, they're both implementing UNCLOS, no, means that they can have a much better chance as well of resolving any disputes between them, no,
Mm-hmm.
including these overlapping claims, because they're now making these claims both in accordance with UNCLOS.
Mm-hmm.
And by engaging in talks with Vietnam, the Philippines and Vietnam are actually going to essentially demonstrate to the world, no, they're showing the world how disputes should be properly managed. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Through calm through calm and deliberate negotiations, without attempting to use force to
Mm-hmm.
pressure or coerce the other side,
I see.
and try to impose themselves on the other side. No? This is completely opposite of what is China,
Mm-hmm.
of what China is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that's why we definitely should be open to that kind of discussion and negotiation. And even if it takes a long time, no, sometimes these kinds of negotiations can take decades. Even if that happens, still, by engaging in it and maintaining good relations,
Mm.
no, while negotiations are pending, we are still demonstrating that we are acting fully in accordance with international law. We are exercising our rights in accordance with international law and acting under the principles of the UN Charter when we do these things.
Okay, and it's a good thing to note that country like Vietnam is not using its force. I remember a few years back when China and Philippines are trying to create some sort of a bilateral discussion to resolve the issue in the West Philippine Sea. Professor Batumbakal.
Yes. Actually, the ASEAN claimants, no, the Southeast Asian claimants, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, they are clearly managing their disputes between each other very well,
Mm.
because they have not engaged in any kind of unlawful use of force against each other. And
Mm.
despite these disputes, they have managed to cooperate well
Mm-hmm.
through the ASEAN framework. No?
Mm.
So That is exactly how the dispute should be managed.
Ah, okay.
It's unfortunate, however, that the biggest claimant, China, who is not a member of ASEAN, it does not share the same values,
Mm.
and it does not treat these disputes in the same way, and instead seeks to impose itself and ensure its dominance, and is trying to force these other nations in Southeast Asia to simply surrender their respective rights and entitlements and simply defer to China's interests and claims.
I see. Okay. Also, I would like to ask this. Would like to get your thoughts on this. So, Representative Rufus Rodriguez of Cagayan de Oro Second District has called for an immediate passage of the bill into law, and China should recognize the bill once it's passed. Mr. Rodriguez said President Marcos Jr. should ignore Beijing's reaction to the proposed measure, saying that the Philippines should not worry about what the Chinese will say. So Philippines must think of its own national interest. Can I get your thoughts on this
Well, that
statement?
is actually the correct approach when it comes to the Maritime Zone Act and the implementation of UNCLOS. The proposed bill is simply implementing our rights under UNCLOS.
Mm-hmm.
It is a bill that establishes with clarity our respective maritime zones and our jurisdictions and authorities and our claims, no, especially in the West Philippine Sea. Um, this is, of course, expected of the Philippines because, as a state party to UNCLOS, it should implement the provisions of UNCLOS in good faith. Okay? So definitely, it should be done. And it's also true that we should not defer to China. We should not
Mm-hmm.
second guess ourselves and think of how China will react to it, no? Before we do it. I mean, it's a given that China will react anyway. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But what is important for us is that we are acting lawfully. We are the ones simply exercising our rights under international law. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And China is expected, as a member of the international community, to also respect the fact that we are exercising our rights under international law. No?
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that has already been pending for far too long, actually.
Mm-hmm.
China will object, China will protest and make a lot of noise, and probably even take other actions
Mm-hmm.
to try to intimidate the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
But all of those will be essentially illegal and contrary to international law.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and it looks like Philippines will persist in its quest to assert her rights on that disputed waters, and in legal way.
Yes, yes, in the legal and correct way.
Correct. Okay. And with that, Professor J. Patumbakal, thank you so much for joining us in the program Front and Center here on Radyo Pilipinas World Service.
Welcome, and thank you again for having me on board.
Okay. And that concludes this edition of Front and Center here on Radyo Pilipinas World Service. Together with our producer Erwin Peñano and technical personnel Milo Junella, this is your host Jerome Toledo. Join us again here on Front and Center. Mabuhay and love the Philippines.
You have just heard and watched Front and Center. Front and Center. Join us again for another edition here on Radyo Pilipinas World Service. Front and Center.